Dr. Matt Wilson's talk is, as you can see, Paying Attention, Digital Media, and Community-Based Critical GIS. Dr. Wilson is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Kentucky and a visiting scholar at the Center for Geographic Analysis at Harvard University. He co-founded and co-directs the New Mappings Collaboratory, which studies and facilitates new engagements with geographic representation, including work in community-based mapping. As part of this larger collaboration, he is also the director of the Community Map Shop, which is a studio that directs mapping resources as driven by community feedback towards understanding, analyzing, and representing emergent and persistent spatial tensions. The Map Shop, I think, is something we're going to learn about more today, right? Okay. So Dr. Wilson's research and writing in critical GIS draws upon science and technology studies and urban political geography to understand the development and proliferation of location-based technologies, with particular attention to the consumer electronics sector. His current research project focuses on the founding of the Laboratory for Computer Graphics at Harvard in 1965, which Matt says is a catalyzing moment in the advent of digital mapping. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Matt Wilson. Yeah, don't do that.
All right, thanks for that. Yeah, this is great. I so appreciate the invite to come down. It's nice to not have to get into an airport when I want to go visit other people and just head down the highway and see such an awesome gathering of individuals interested, maybe broadly interested in geography. I know there's a geography class here. I've seen the sort of homework assignment being circulated through the room. I don't know how many of those topics I'm going to hit, but we'll try to get as many of them as we can so you can get that homework assignment done. But I truly appreciate this opportunity to come and speak with you a bit about some of the work that I've been doing. Today's talk is a little bit more about what I do in the classroom. I thought I might take a moment just to talk to you a little bit about what geography is. I think geography as a discipline has a real public relations problem. Many of you, if you've had geography, you probably have only had it prior to college in some like junior high classroom, understanding states and capitals or understanding capes and bays or some sort of physical geography thing. Maybe if you've had it in introductory college classes, it's largely been a kind of study of world regions or a study of peoples and cultures of the world. Geography is a sort of fascinating discipline that one finds himself in. My undergraduate training was at a small school called Northwest Missouri State University. I grew up in a town called Pumpkin Center, Missouri. Population 6, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. My grandfather, my mother, my father, my brother, and the basketball coach who lived across the street. So I grew up in a small town, and I was really interested in architecture. I was really interested in sort of how to design and think about spatial relationships. And as a result of that, I sort of stumbled into a geography class where I learned that you could not only be the kind of creator of space, the creator of spatial relationships, but you could actually bring sophisticated social scientific methods to study those spatial relationships. I thought that was really fascinating. So I was a geography major in my undergraduate degree and got a double minor in computer science and something called GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems. And then, like many who come upon graduating, I sort of wanted to kick the can down the road a little bit further and didn't want to really make a decision about what to do post-graduation. And so I was fortunate enough to apply and get into the University of Washington's geography program in Seattle. So as a 21-year-old fresh-faced farm kid from Missouri, I moved to the streets of Seattle, really, into a kind of a very expensive part of the city and learned all about the kind of interesting work that's being done in what's called kind of social justice and geography, and learning more about how geography was not only a tool to understand spatial relationships, but it was actually a tool for activism, right? Of ways to change and imagine new forms of spatial involvement, new forms of spatial interaction. And geography was providing you not only the tool sets, but really the kind of vision and the kind of conviction, right? To understand a changing planet and to understand that that changing planet begins here at this very moment in the communities in which we live and serve. And so that's really what draws me again and again back to this field. And what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about one aspect of this research, which has always evolved around how to take the tools of mapping, the tools of GIS, the tools of web-based media more generally, and apply that to change. Apply that to change in our communities, change in our region, in our state. This is within a broader set of research initiatives that I would call critical GIS. That's a kind of a $7 word or phrase here. But what that largely means is that I study not only the methods by which we map, but I also study the implications for those mapping technologies. So for me, to be a critical GIS person means understanding the technology as an expert would, understanding how to use the technology to understand complex spatial or social phenomena, but then understanding that that technology itself leaves an imprint on daily life, from the pocket cell phone device that you're carrying all the way to state-based military interventions. The geographic technologies that we come encounter with every day shift and change the way we interact with each other in this room. It shifts the way we interact with each other in a geopolitical space as well. And so critical GIS is really this kind of thinking through of how these technologies change the way we interact in the 21st century, all right? Okay. So this particular presentation is based upon an academic publication, something really boring and dusty in one of these things called a library, right? So you can actually get it online. It's a journal called Cultural Geographies, which is kind of a fun journal that explores the recesses of cultural inquiry and cultural phenomena. But this particular piece was just recently published at the rapid pace of 3 years of publication. It's finally available in very limited libraries and academic holdings around the world. But if you're interested in reading about this, feel free to email me. It's probably the fastest way to get access to the content. But the paper itself is situated within a special issue, grappling with this key question. What do we do as technology continues to change the way we interact in the world, while also changing the things that we can make memory of, right? Because we're very good at sort of interacting, you might say, in a digital space. You know, we use Yik Yak, we use the Snapchats, we use the Facebooks, we use the, et cetera, right? To interact in a very kind of immediate way. But what does this do about the shifting register of cultural memory? Back in the good old day, we had libraries and museums, we had books and things that captured human history. And today, we still have those things, right? But the priorities have somewhat changed. The documentation of everyday life is captured within these digital devices for which we have very little access to, right? So what this project is attempting to sort of think through is a couple of different things. The first one is kind of a big leap within the academy. It's to think about GIS and other forms of spatial technology as just one part of a rapidly evolving media sphere, right? So what happens when we think of GI science and the kind of social scientific methods behind GIS as part of a broader media conglomerate, a broader media economy that has to compete and scrap it out with things like Yik Yak, Facebook, the YouTubes, right? What happens when we think about GIS as just one part of this broader media constellation? That's the first thing that this talk is attempting to do. But the second part of this is a bit more speculative, and it's attempting to try to think through attentional design, what I'm calling attentional design. What does it mean if we treat spatial technologies as media? What does it mean to craft to what people pay attention using that media? Right? Slowly but surely, the GI sciences are learning about how to think about these technologies as storytelling devices, right? But I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that those storytelling devices can compete with Hulu, with Netflix, right? And so what happens when the really compelling, hard-hitting, sort of soul-searching questions that the Academy has been tasked with addressing, what happens when those things are trapped in journal publications that only a select group of universities even can access? And so what does it mean when we start to think about these spatial technologies as part of a media sphere? I think it's both a sad story that emerges and one with slight moments of optimism and possibility. And so today I want to sort of think through what does it mean to consider community-based technologies like GIS as contributing to this notion of attentional design. how do we do attentional design work? And how does that work serve the constituencies that we're most interested in? Okay. So in doing so, I want to suggest that the societal challenges that we have that come about from the proliferation of code and computing and mobile forms and others, that these kinds of challenges actually have to change the way we think about the GI sciences, the way we think about spatial analysis within geography more generally. I think that by thinking of these technologies as media, we have to change our scholarly as well as academic agendas, right? It's not the same universe that we were playing in just 20 years ago. And so for me, this talk is very much about thinking through the implications of an engaged GI science. What does it mean to actually use this technology to engage community members, to actually change the way we think about our communities and about our environment? And I think that much of that has to be rethought in the wake of social media. For me, the takeaway is that after Facebook, right, AFB, maybe it's a shorthand, after Facebook, we have to rethink engagement. We have to rethink the role of the academy. And I think that we can see that most clearly in the most precarious moments of life, right? Around nonprofits and community-based organizations, where you see that these kinds of technology changes are causing intense and real material pressures upon nonprofits and community-based work. And so for me, this paper begins from this moment of trying to think through what are the possibilities and what are the potential or persistent problems as technology changes and the missions of nonprofits begin to enlarge, right? Okay. Okay, so I want to argue, if I'm using my technology right, I want to argue then, with this kind of creepy graphic from the New York Times, I want to argue that an engaged critical GI science necessitates a consideration of what I call a general mediatization of social relations, which includes things like social networking, things like location-based services. Those of you geographers out there have likely heard of this word, location-based services, as well as even more, you might say, marginal activities like microblogging. Microblogging here referring to things like blogs, as well as what other technology would you consider microblogging? Twitter, Twitters, right? A kind of microblogging. So I'm arguing that we need to reconsider what it means to engage with mapping technologies in the wake of these new forms of social media. Right? New forms of networking, location-based services, and microblogging techniques. Okay. So I have a research question. This is my research question. I'm trying to figure out what are the implications of persistent change in online digital media? What happens when digital media rapidly changes? And who is most greatly affected by those changes? And I think this question for me has relevance in thinking through our response in the realm of social justice. So I want to examine these kind of persistent changes as they rub against the everydayness of working with information and communication technologies, as well as spatial technologies with community-based organizations. And I'm going to do that in three parts to this talk. I'm going to hold on through the end. The first part, I want to talk about new efforts underway at the University of Kentucky around what Judy has referred to as the community map shop world. So I want to talk to you a little bit about my experience doing community-based work with a classroom called Community Map Shop, which is now in its third year. Secondly, I want to think through the tensions that emerge around persistent change in the information technology space. What happens to these very locally based, community-based organizations and nonprofits when the technologies that they've come to rely upon constantly change, like pulling the rug out from under them, right? What kinds of consistent and persistent pressures are placed upon these organizations in the wake of that persistent change? And thirdly, this word. I want to draw out the challenges of community-based work as attention work. I want to argue here that in the wake of persistent change in information technologies, that the work of community-based organizations and nonprofits is attention work, right? And this is where some nonprofits are not measuring up, right? And it's not surprising, I think, for those of us who study media, that they're not catching up. Okay, so let's start then with this first sort of section on community-based partnerships. And I want to think through here, just sort of show briefly how I've begun to think about community-based work by showing a video. This video is a couple years old, but this is a video that I use, and I have used since 2012-ish, to show nonprofits and community-based organizations in Lexington, Kentucky, what we can do when we start partnering around complex spatial tools like GIS. And so I'm going to show this video. It's about 4 minutes long. I might need some media help here, but we'll see what happens. So, okay. She's got me covered. It's always embarrassing when someone who teaches information technology can't run.
My name is Matt Wilson. I'm a new faculty member in the Department of Geography and in the College of Arts and Sciences. This last semester we participated in an experiment called GIS Workshop, which is it's an effort to better bridge the campus and community through university community partnerships around community-based projects. GIS Workshop really stands for Geographic Information Systems, and the idea is to sort of take students who otherwise have not had experience or exposure to using their knowledge in a real-world setting and apply it to community-based problems in the Lexington community.
My name is Ryan Cook, and I'm the founder and director of Seedleaf. Seedleaf is a nonprofit organization. We install and maintain gardens. Our mission is to nourish communities by growing, cooking, sharing, and recycling food.
My name is John Finney. I'm a student of German and Geography at UK, and I partnered with a community organization called Seedleaf. The idea is to bring local organic produce to people who otherwise would not have access to such tasty and nutritious food. We
have 8 community gardens that are free U-Pick spaces, and we also have 8 market gardens. We had the chance to work with a group from the University of Kentucky.
We were trying to create some maps using things like census data.
And they helped us out a lot with regard to connecting with volunteers.
A workshop such as this helps build skills in a more organic way. With this sort of workshop course, you have to start off asking yourself, what am I trying to do? How do I do it?
We really want to demonstrate that we're doing our programming in these food deserts for a reason. Seedleaf would benefit from working together with the GIS workshop going forward, and we'd like to partner however we can.
My name is Kirby Neal. I'm with the Central Kentucky Council for Peace and Justice, and the Council's been working here in Lexington for over 30 years on a variety of local projects and in peace education and things of this sort, but we try to work very much in coalitions and with other groups.
My name's Amanda Whitbeck, and I'm a student in the Geography Department at the University of Kentucky. And I worked on a community-based partnership with the Kentucky Council on Peace and Justice through a GIS workshop. The primary focus of the Lexington Youth Initiative was to give a voice to more high-risk youth.
Last October, we became very concerned about the shortage of youth services, and people began to discuss other closings and other activities for youth that were no longer present in the community, and we realized that our services for youth, particularly inner city and at-risk youth, have been shrinking dramatically.
And we went through a survey that they had worked with youth in Lexington to show the priorities of youth.
These youth helped develop questions that they thought were really important to ask other youth. We were very excited when we could begin to map these kinds of issues. We could say, where are the kids that are responding to this living, and where are the needs, and how do they compare with where the services are?
They're looking to create more opportunities for leadership opportunities or media opportunities to learn new skills.
We hope that that will make a significant difference to our at-risk kids in the community.
And these maps that we made will probably be used in the next year to make some real differences in the Lexington community.
GIS Workshop is a great opportunity, primarily because it provides students with a capstone experience that allows them to sort of communicate the skills that they've already learned in their first and second years in an environment that allows them to partner with community organizations. It's also a great opportunity for community partners who otherwise would not have access to these rather expensive and sometimes time-consuming technologies to be able to spend 12 or 13 weeks working with university students to build products that they can actually use in their day-to-day life. GIS Workshop is just one example of the many ways that we are trying to build connections to the community within the College of Arts and Sciences, and I look forward to the future opportunities to do this kind of work.
And so I want to just sort of run through a few of the, really briefly, just run through some of the examples of the kinds of mapping partnerships that we've worked on over the last 3+ years. And then what I want to move into is a kind of what you might call a more meta discussion. So if we step back from 2-3 years of doing community-based work, what can I begin to argue has happened? How is this, even in the span of 3 to 4 years, how have these efforts become even more important and even more challenging? And that's really what the purpose of this talk is, to sort of think about these kinds of partnerships with GIS and mapping under the microscope, sort of look at them under the microscope and say, what is possible now and what is not so easily possible now, given changes in digital media. So there's a number of different partnerships we've worked with. One of these have included mapping potential sites of nonprofit healthcare services, mapping predatory lending activities in the city of Lexington, mapping food systems in low-income neighborhoods, mapping the social implications of post office closures in rural Appalachian counties, mapping the possibilities of historical tourism in many of our rural counties, mapping things as basic as stray animal control. That's an interesting story I can talk to you about maybe afterwards. Mapping rural economic development service regions, helping local Appalachian counties know how to utilize federal and state resources to better spur on rural economic development. Mapping historical preservation efforts that are underway throughout Kentucky. Mapping user-generated data about river water quality. Perhaps in some of your geography classrooms you've talked about citizen science and crowdsourced methods to collect data about things as basic as river and air quality in our state, as well as mapping mobile data that's collected by volunteers to help push our municipalities to open up their government and data collection efforts. So this is sort of an example of the many different ways in which GIS Workshop and Community Map Shop have worked together with community-based organizations to do mapping work. And for me, a lot of this is really about thinking through how to use these technologies to capture new audiences, right? To capture new constituencies. And I actually think that at this moment, we have never been, right, in the history of human technological development, we have never been more capable of using these technologies to study the myriad of scalar problems and issues that affect our everyday life, right? Our devices are faster, they use data streams that are much more quick. Our ability to store information is increasingly cheaper, right? We're never more capable than we are now of doing this kind of work, right? But yet, these kinds of persistent changes in social media and spatial media have actually caused us to rethink, I think, some of our public engagement efforts within the GI sciences. For me, it's actually impossible to ignore these new developments in social media as somehow distinct from the academic mission of the GI sciences. I think that's a really dangerous ignorance, you might say, to ignore what's happening in spatial and social media as somehow separate from what's happening within the academic GI sciences. Increasingly, spatial media are interpolated by social media. Their logics of development, their marketing, their advertising, their use increasingly overlap and align themselves with one another. And I'll just talk through some examples here. The internet meme has been heralded as a leading form of viral engagement, right? The meme as a new form of cultural engagement, as a mashup of various commercial and cultural content, while corporations compete for control over our attention. As we can see from just a couple years ago in the recent marketing campaign by Microsoft to unseat Google as the primary internet search engine. New human-computer interactions further lock in our ways of being in the world, as software like Apple's Siri product constitutes spaces where the friction between the material and the seemingly virtual become less of an issue, right? We're blending between the material and the immaterial parts of our world. I think these interactions are no longer exceptional, and instead they signal a kind of public that's increasingly demanding social spatial mediation of everyday life. We want more of these technologies. We want them on our watch. We can't be bothered to reach into our pocket or into our purses. We need them on our persons. Yep. And these kind of devices are data hungry. They lead to new opportunities, you might say, in scare quotes, for innovation in digital infrastructure. As we can remember from the South by Southwest gathering back a couple years ago, where homeless bodies were enrolled and turned into wireless infrastructure, right? Therefore, I suggest that these partnerships around digital media demands an attention to the myriad intersections of capital and of innovation, between devices and our desires for technological futures, between imaginations for a world that's different than our own and the very real mechanics of urban governance. This is where the GI sciences should be situated, right? Recognizing that these are the tensions of our growing public and our growing sort of media literate society. Okay, so we'll go on to the second part of this talk. So while engaging in these different kinds of community partnerships and community map shop, I've become increasingly interested in how these nonprofits and how these community-based organizations use data. How do they use data? How do they represent their practices using spatial data? And so I want to think through here some theoretical work, you might say, on how community nonprofits and community-based organizations currently think about data use and currently think about spatial and social media. So in what follows, I want to sort of think through what I'm calling and what some scholars within media studies are calling practices of exteriorization. Really expensive multi-syllabic word, meaning that we exteriorize things, right? Our ability to sort of maintain a dialogue, right now, has been because we've exteriorized the moments of language. We've studied it from, age 3 to 4, right? We've exteriorized those methods in forms that allow us to train ourselves to be able to collectively understand one another through language. Other forms of exteriorization you might know of, books, right? Back in the day, we exteriorized human knowledge in the form of books. But I want to think about what do the practices of exteriorization look like now, right? Who owns the means of production and access to the practice of exteriorization now? And I want to argue that nonprofits are an interesting group to look at because they perhaps are the more precarious organizations within society that really depend upon this kind of exteriorization. So in what follows, I want to present some observations from interviews and conversations I've had with nonprofit organization community leaders to sort of think through how they're using these kinds of technologies. All right. Network, distribute, and build communities. In this quote from the Lexington Herald Leader, a long-standing community organizer, Tanya Torp, on the right, was featured as part of a larger effort to tackle issues around food security in the northeast end of Lexington. For those of you who've been to Lexington, the northeast end is the location of historically Black and lower-income communities within the city. Increasingly, Tanya's work, her everyday work in communities, is the work of networking and distribution, of connecting individuals and organizations, and of building community through these very specific connections. And you can probably see where I'm going here. However, Tanya's work, like many of the individuals I work with in Community Map Shop, is increasingly dependent upon digital mediation, even as they suspect a kind of digital divide. For some partners I've spoken with, for instance, social media websites such as Twitter and Facebook are useful to gather information and perhaps less useful in getting information out to the individuals they service. Simply put here, farmers don't Twitter, right? The digital media that are used by community partners are subject to technological shifts and evolutions. Many of these changes and sort of fixes on community-based uses of social media are deeply frustrating, even if they're mundane. And they demand vigilance by these partners who want to remain connected. If you want to remain connected into the system, you have to deal with all the changes that these social media bring on. They want to make certain that they have the latest and the widely used platforms for online presence, platforms that seem to be in a constant state of change. Most commonly referenced by community partners I've worked with is the frustration of the forced shift, and perhaps you remember this, the forced shift from Facebook groups to Facebook pages, a slight change in functionality, as demonstrated by this quote. This shift forces community organizations that rely upon Facebook as a primary vehicle to communicate with their volunteers, to communicate with their constituents, to, quote, start over from scratch. And while this may seem mundane, banal, not really a big issue, for me it underlines, right? It underlines the potential consequences that come with utilizing online social media as the primary way in which organizations that are committed to social justice gain access to members and audiences that they want to inform and activate. And it's difficult to know which of these digital information technologies are appropriate to adopt and which ones will likely wither. Website designs may eventually appear outdated. Social networking applications may go out of business. Anyone remember Friendster? Maybe not. Free functionalities that we come to accept on online social media may be risked rolling into paid subscriptions. And when staffed by low-paid or volunteered labor, nonprofits may not feel particularly compelled to invest that time, when the knowledge required to maintain such online communities may disappear with the frequent shifts in a primary volunteer labor force, right? Why would you train your interns to do this work when you know that in about 3 months, you're going to get a new crop of interns, right? This is the moment where the precarity associated with a growing nonprofit and community-based sector increasingly shows some, you might say, wrinkles in the use of social media. For organizations that recognize the opportunity of personalizing their mission through digital information technologies, the topic of storage is one of additional frustration. Perhaps you've been here. Many sites that store photos, videos, and documentation have free data storage, but only under a certain threshold. As a nonprofit organization, the management of that threshold becomes part of your everyday practices that surround digital work to make sure you don't go over the free limit on Dropbox, Flickr, YouTube, etc., right? And in this quote, a volunteer from an organization called Faith Feeds describes a decision to transfer digital content from one free service to another as a way to manage that threshold for online free storage. And in an environment of kind of constant competition over a very small group of volunteers, community-based organizations necessarily have to use online social media as a way to market their specific mission. This is the only way that they really gain access to organizations that they might partner with, to individuals that might volunteer with them. And as a result, Facebook, Twitter, and even YouTube become the kind of everyday tools of outreach, the everyday tools of reaching out to potential audiences and potential volunteers. However, community-based organizations must make decisions about how to best spend their energies. In this quote from the director of Seedleaf, who we saw in the video, we can see the tension over this kind of digital work. For Ryan, time spent on Facebook and on Google Docs organizing his small group of volunteers is always in direct competition with time spent in the gardens. Indeed, there are trade-offs between fully engaging digital information technologies, such as social media, and actually doing the core mission of your organization, right? There are discrete and material trade-offs between doing the work and getting involved in online media. If Ryan is not in the garden, Seedleaf work isn't happening, right? It's very basic. If he's spending time trying to remember his password to Google Docs, he's not out there working in the gardens. For many community-based organizations in Lexington that I've worked with, volunteers, potential donors, and partner groups are kept informed through email marketing companies like MailChimp. Maybe you've heard of this one. However, according to some organizations, the free functionalities behind these kinds of web-based marketing companies are always shifting, requiring organizations to either start paying subscriptions or migrate their contacts and their content to another email marketing company with similar features. The frustrations of time spent learning new web-based programs to continue the infrastructural work of building community to connect and to network is an actual concern amongst nonprofits and community-based organizations. And I think this particular concern takes on significant importance when you have these kinds of competitions over what I'm calling attentional control. Who controls your ability to maintain attention? And I want to talk a bit more about what I mean by attentional control in the last section of the paper. But before I want to go on, I want to kind of underline what I see kind of as a summary, right, of the basic concerns that nonprofits and community-based organizations voice around these kinds of technologies. Web-based software changes at a more rapid pace than desktop software, right? We can see that in our own lives, right? For organizations, this means choosing among several tools and engaging in that decision-making work constantly. As web-based tools shift, as functionality changes, as free services move to subscription-based services. And this kind of shifting landscape is compounded by the fact that personnel at nonprofits are also constantly changing, right? As account passwords get lost in the shift between personnel, and the everyday work of maintaining digital infrastructure has to be relearned by new volunteers, by new staff. The tools that often have free functionality causing some workers to have to be somewhat creative in the distribution of video. Maybe you've got too many videos on YouTube, you need to move it over to Dropbox, your Flickr account has become too large, you've got to move those photos to an offline storage for a moment. So this kind of stuff actually is work for nonprofits, and I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that this is not work. Things like managing free storage ceilings, the need for multiple modes of communication. These things are actual things that nonprofit workers have to deal with. These concerns, I think, extend long-standing issues around equipment needs and bandwidth requirements, which would have been part of the late 90s concerns around nonprofit usages. This is just the latest iteration of concerns in digital information technologies, especially as impact and measurement regimes that are necessary to keep nonprofits funded are also constantly shifting and changing under this very neoliberal government. All right. So in this last section, I want to sort of unpack what I mean by attentional design and think specifically about the implications of these changes in media for attention, right? Something we really care about, especially within the academy, right? Where we're attention brokers, right? We're trying to get people to pay attention to us. So to do this, I want to return to MailChimp, the email marketing company that is often used by nonprofits and community-based organizations to sort of work through and think about the concerns and opportunities for the capturing of attention. MailChimp, as they say here, MailChimp helps users to build a list with custom forms and Facebook integration, to create a template with web-based images and file hosting, to send your campaign to that list, right? With segmentation by location, by activity, by interest, with autoresponder bots, right? Autoresponder bots, enhanced through social networking. And to track the results of this campaign with automated reports, Twitter trending data, and Google Analytics integration, right? MailChimp is just one of the many web-based information technologies enrolled by community-based partners to support the core work of their organization. There are also other sites used to gather information and to connect with online social networks with things like Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest, as well as sites used to quickly publish information to free hosted websites like WordPress and Weebly. Community-based organizations use digital information technologies for web-based storage of documentation, videos, and images through Dropbox, Google Docs, Flickr, and YouTube, as well as enrolling more specialized sites also online to manage financial and volunteer resources. These sites necessitate an assemblage of names, passwords, security questions, and mobile phone backups. They generate scores of automated emails to account holders, reminding them of new content in the network, new activities, new followers, new requests, and account privacy changes. In addition to these daily reminders, changes in functionality and changes in personnel burden these community-based organizations with the mundane work of maintaining their sites and thereby maintaining visibility within the diverse networks they serve. CBOs or community-based organizations' struggles over digital information technologies are real challenges to have and maintain a Facebook page, to tweet, and to follow other Twitter users, to engage in the personalization of their campaigns using email marketing websites. This, for me, is a struggle over capacity. And yet, as I'm attempting to argue here, these everyday practices are more than a struggle over the capacity that might be everyday, the capacity to access technologies, to get more permanent personnel. This is more than just a very basic daily capacity to engage publics. These struggles are more, both interior to these more technical concerns and external, situational, conditional. There are broader challenges that are productive of the conditions that give rise to these more mundane struggles of community-based organizations. By tracing the data and the technological practices of community-based work, as in this piece of research, I'm trying to understand the struggles over retaining attentional control within what I want to call, along with some media scholars, the attention economy, which is dominated by the cultural industry. By attentional control, I mean work that is targeted directly at your human capacity to pay attention. And I recognize that community-based organizations are but minor players. We're minor players in a rapidly unfolding attention economy where cultural industries dominate, including TV, radio conglomerates, the entertainment sector, online social media, yik-yaks, Snapchats, albeit with different histories of involvement, different speeds of interaction. So the question of the implications of persistent change in online digital media immediately, I think, demands a much more complex response. We can't just simply better train our personnel. We can't just simply have more sustained access to digital information technologies. We can't just simply stabilize or centralize these web services into very specific websites. We just can't have better university-community partnerships. The development of new and tailored digital information tools for nonprofit sectors is not enough, nor is the specialized or the tailored food sector website services for the nonprofit sector, or maybe the organic, right? The organic part of the food sector of nonprofits. We can't just continue to design new websites to handle these boutique, developments. These strategies, while indeed noble pursuits and incredibly useful within very precise space and times, I think are instead band-aids. Band-aids on a much wider spread problem of attentional overload. Very basic. Community-based work increasingly necessitates digital work. Interestingly, this work can not only pull the attention of organizational staff away from their core mission, but much of this digital work is about fostering audiences through attentional control. If you're doing community-based work in a nonprofit, you are engaging in attentional work, right? We can't sort of deny this. The work of building Facebook pages, following Twitter users, posting blog entries, and managing web-based content is largely the work of drawing people into the mission of an organization, to personalize that organization while promoting their specific agenda. And when there are persistent changes in digital media, an organization has to remain vigilant in the maintenance of their online presence, and it's a slippery slope. Community partners that I work with understand the practices of the necessary work of building and strengthening organizational networks and providing opportunities for further involvement. However, if we reconceptualize this as part of an attention economy that's overrun by the cultural industry, perhaps we can underline that this work is complex. The interactions are important, but oftentimes fleeting. And there are constant changes in how we do this attentional work. So following a philosopher named Bernard Stiegler, the struggle over attention unravels the core of the humanities practices of exteriorization, of retention, of cultural collective memory, and the production of humanity itself. Digital media, extending Stiegler's concern here, rewires the conduits through which collectives are made possible, and further, how culture is produced, right? These technologies are not just moments of recreation and entertainment. They're actually changing not only how we pay attention, but to what we pay attention, right? And this is why in the GI sciences, we can't just pretend that all of this is happening and it's not a part of our world, right? We have to recognize that if we're building compelling media to change the way we think about social justice, then we have to understand the ways in which exteriorization is happening now. So without going into kind of the complicated post-structuralist French theory here, I want to just sort of say a little bit about Stiegler's theory as a kind of conclusion, as a way to think through the implications for these changes in digital media. Stiegler calls attention to the long-range effects of attention control, what he terms, quote, the psychotechnological systems of psychopower. Big phrase. But for him, these kinds of systems operate and human culture hangs in the balance, right? That if we really submit to the world that we live in now and the technologies that we have access to now, then the world that we are capable of creating is ultimately conditioned by those technologies, which means that the people that control those technologies and have the ability to interact and change them really have much more power than we probably give them credit for. Okay. I suggest that a further examination of the use of these kinds of technologies by community-based organizations can give us a much more complex understanding, perhaps, of the long-range challenges of the utilization of social media. We have to trace these kinds of nomadic practices as community-based organizations move from website to website, from service to service. We have to sort of trace these out and understand that they are not just marginal activities, but instead they are increasingly becoming the central activity of nonprofit and community-based work. These technologies, according to Stiegler, are thus both the problem and the solution, right? And as such, I want to suggest that it becomes important to develop new practices that build forms of awareness that constitute collective memory, and cultures of action amid these persistent changes in technology. And so therefore we can't just close off and pretend like Luddites that these technologies are not for us, not created by us. But instead we have to retool, we have to train ourselves to figure out how to engage in these tools, to engage in these technologies, to cause opportunities for real change to emerge, right? And it's about collective memory, right? If we're really thinking critically about the use of technologies like Snapchat and Yik Yak, right? Which is dominant on college campuses. Perhaps many of you are doing it right now. I'll check it later and see what you said about me. But if we're thinking about this, these are yet another example of an incredible narrowing off of our attention span, right? Forcing us to pay attention to only those things that are immediate to us, in our immediate vicinity, and of immediate concern to us, right? This is a real challenge if you're engaged in a struggle over social justice or causing awareness about spatial injustices more generally. In order to constitute these kinds of collective memories, we have to kind of rethink how to engage these tools, how to constitute new forms of awareness, right, that are not going to continue to narrow and create a myopic viewpoint on what the world is like. All right. So this is sort of the major thing. We've got to constitute these kind of collective memories and cultures of action. But to do this, I think I've thought in three ways of how this immediately impacts my work. And perhaps you're thinking about how this impacts your work. But in the first case, this has meant encouraging longer-term partnerships, right? This means that work with community partners never really begins and ends in the classroom. It has to have different speeds and volumes. It has to occur within the context of an attention economy. And we are operating within a very privileged space of society, the university. In the olden days, perhaps this was the place in which we engaged in long-range thought, right? We thought through the shifting changes in human culture, and we tried to understand how do they impact today? How do they impact tomorrow? What are the possibilities for the future? And if we think about community-based work in the university, we have to think in terms of long-term partnerships. If nonprofits are even more precarious today than they were yesterday, then the university has an even tougher, right, a more difficult responsibility to maintain a kind of touch point to technology, to resources, to expertise, right? This is the place in which many of those ideas can take form. And so we have to think much more long-term. This will not just work in small little service learning boutique experiences championed by our presidents and our provosts, right? These have to be really thought through and responsive, sustained engagements. And I think that has to occur in the context of the attention economy. Second, taking these partnerships seriously has meant developing a fuller range of technological inventories and digital strategies for building audiences and thereby collective memory. In other words, it's not only useful to partner around GIS, around new spatial media broadly understood. Instead, we have to build collectives around a multimedia approach, right? And we have to sort of think creatively about the use of these tools in many different contexts. Finally, this research into the implications for persistent change in online media, for me, has underlined attention work as a key aspect of action, right? These things go hand in hand. If we want action, we have to change the way we pay attention. If we want action that's truly interesting, we have to change to what we pay attention to, right? And so I think this is what's most important as we begin to study persistent change in spatial media. Indeed, what is needed is not necessarily new technologies, nor new technical practices to alleviate the anxieties of digital culture, and we all feel it, right? We're probably all checking our email right now on our phone, soon we'll be checking it on our watch. So we don't really need new technologies. We've got the technologies down, it's cool. We don't really need new technical practices, they're pervasive, they're constantly changing, we just have to embrace them. But what we do need is an awakening as to the ways in which these technologies, including new spatial media, are capturing our attention. We have to understand the mechanics of that relationship. An awakening as to how to foster, how to actually design new attentional practices in community-based partnerships. That's the strategy now. We have to understand what's going on and begin to make incremental steps to shift both how we pay attention and to what we pay attention to. And I think I'll end there. Thanks very much.